Everest holds secrets that rarely reach the public. Beneath the snow and silence lie stories frozen in time, marked by courage, sacrifice, and fatal choices. Bodies that became landmarks, like Green Boots Cave and Sleeping Beauty, remind us that every step can be the last. These Mount Everest deaths reveal the mountain's darkest side. These tragic climber stories show that in the Everest Death Zone, the line between dream and tragedy is razor thin. And it's this mysterious side of Everest that you're about to discover now. Frances Arsentive had a daring dream to become the first American woman to reach the summit of Everest without supplemental oxygen. Alongside her husband, Sergei, she set off with courage, but without radios or the support of Sherpas. That choice, which at first seemed like just another display of self-reliance, would prove how small decisions can weigh tons when you're in the so-called Everest Death Zone. They reached the summit after the safe time window had passed, when the descent was already a major risk. That's when everything began to spiral out of control. Separated by darkness and exhaustion, Sergei vanished while trying to help his wife, leaving Frances alone in an environment that offers no forgiveness. It was like stepping onto a busy highway outside the crosswalk. The odds of disaster were overwhelming. When other climbers found her, Frances was showing clear signs of paradoxical hypothermia, already stripped of part of her clothing, a cruel symptom of the confusion caused by lack of oxygen. Her body remained on the mountain for 9 years, known among climbers as Sleeping Beauty, until it was moved by Ian Wood. The story still echoes today in the accounts of Mount Everest deaths, a reminder that every detail can turn triumph into tragedy. And yet, this was far from the only time the mountain revealed its merciless face. David Sharp was a British climber with experience on several mountains, but he chose to face Everest almost entirely alone. No radio, no team, no Sherpa support. He relied solely on his endurance. But in the Everest Death Zone, every detail matters, and he ended up collapsing inside the infamous Green Boots Cave, a place that would become a symbol of many Everest tragedies. That night, more than 40 climbers passed by him. Some tried to help, others pressed on, since at 26,000 feet the added burden of a rescue can mean death for everyone involved. The incident exposed a painful dilemma. How far does the duty to help go when your own life is equally at risk? This episode remains etched among the tragic climber stories that shook the mountaineering world. The impact was enormous. Edmund Hillary, the first man to reach the summit, harshly criticized the fact that so many had left Sharp behind. His death sparked a wave of debates about ethics, courage, and selfishness in extreme environments. For many, Green Boots Cave ceased to be just a navigation marker and became a silent reminder that, on Everest, the line between survival and abandonment is razor thin, and this was far from the only example of how heavy decisions pile up on its icy slopes. Hannelore Schmatz, a German climber, ascended the mountain with her husband and refused to turn back even when he warned her about the sudden shift in weather. Just steps away from safety, they attempted to bivouac at 28,000 feet without proper shelter. In the Everest Death Zone, decisions like this show how quickly small choices can become irreversible. Exhausted, Hannelore asked only for a sip of water before succumbing to the brutal cold. Her body remained seated, eyes open, becoming a haunting ghost that climbers would see along the route. For many, this sight carried more weight than any flag planted at the summit, etching itself into the memory of Everest tragedies. In 1984, a storm swept away her remains, erasing what had already been described as one of the strangest tragic climber stories on the mountain. Until then, she had been remembered as a fixed landmark, much like the Green Boots Cave, but with the chilling, human expression of someone who fought until the very last moment. What happened to Hannelore paved the way for other stories, even more unforgettable, to gather on Everest slopes. Rob Hall, an experienced guide from New Zealand, had already led several groups to the summit and claimed for personal ascents. That year, he was guiding Doug Hansen, a client who had failed in a previous attempt and dreamed of finally reaching the top. But the decision to push past the safe to PM turnaround time was the first step toward one of the greatest Everest tragedies ever recorded. Caught in the infamous 1996 storm, Hall and Hansen were left vulnerable in the heart of the Everest Death Zone. While others managed to descend, the two remained trapped on the mountain, unable to escape the brutal cold. What stood out most was that Rob, even knowing there was no chance of rescue, refused to abandon his client. For some guides, loyalty outweighed survival itself. His final radio transmission was to his pregnant wife, one of the most heartbreaking moments among tragic climber stories. Hall's body still rests on Everest today, a permanent reminder of courage and sacrifice. This episode became a turning point in discussions about risk, ethics, and human limits in commercial expeditions, and it was far from the only time that chasing the summit demanded a price too high to pay. Shreya Shaklorfine, a Canadian born in Nepal, carried the dream of climbing Everest since childhood. To finance her expedition, she mortgaged her own home and invested nearly $100,000 in the journey. But the mountain, infamous for countless Mount Everest deaths, exacts a high price from those who attempt it without proper physical preparation. Despite her condition, she pressed on, climbing past the safe turnaround time and relying heavily on supplemental oxygen to fight fatigue. On the descent, her body could no longer respond, and not even the Sherpa's assistance could bring her back. This stands as one of the Everest tragedies that reveal how the line between perseverance and recklessness can prove fatal. Her body was eventually draped with the Canadian flag, turning into a symbol of sacrifice and determination. Among the many tragic climber stories, hers is remembered not only for boldness, but also for the emotional cost carried by her family. Just as Green Boots Cave preserves silent memories, Shreya's journey underscores how every step on Everest can be decisive. Joshua Chariot Kirui dreamed of becoming the first African to reach the summit of Everest without supplemental oxygen. He had experience on peaks like Kilimanjaro and Mount Kenya, but the challenge of facing the Everest Death Zone without extra support pushed the risks to an extreme level. This ambition placed his name among the recent additions to the long list of Mount Everest deaths. He came within just 160 feet of the summit, but refused the emergency oxygen offered by his Sherpa. Within minutes, he slipped into confusion caused by severe hypoxia, a common element in many tragic climber stories on the mountain. What stood out was that his fate was not the result of an accident, but of conviction. He wanted to conquer the peak purely, without assistance. His body was later found in a crevasse, while his Sherpa vanished without a trace. The family chose to leave him there, becoming part of the mountain itself, reinforcing the notion that Everest is a silent graveyard for many. Joshua's tragedy now stands among the great Everest tragedies, reminding the world that, just like Green Boots Cave, every story carries a symbolic weight that transcends borders. Scott Fisher was one of the most respected American climbers, known for pushing limits and summiting mountains without supplemental oxygen. But when he arrived on Everest in 1996, he was already sick and exhausted. This condition left him vulnerable in the middle of one of the deadliest Everest tragedies ever recorded. During the infamous storm of that year, Fisher was unable to keep up with the group and was left behind. His body was later found showing signs of paradoxical hypothermia, jacket open, gloves missing, as if he had fallen into a trance. These haunting details turn his death into yet another of the tragic climber stories that reveal the brutal toll of the Everest Death Zone. His body still rests on the mountain today, reminding climbers that even the most experienced can succumb. Fisher, who led the Mountain Madness team, ultimately became a symbol of the cost of a miscalculated expedition. Much like Green Boots Cave or the Sleeping Beauty case, his presence serves as a silent warning that Everest never stops giving. Above 26,000 feet, the human body enters a state of silent collapse. The so-called Everest Death Zone is not just a dramatic term, it marks the point where the thin air can no longer sustain even the body's basic functions. The brain, lungs, and heart begin to fail, and even the simplest task can demand the energy of a marathon. Hypoxia leads to mental confusion, hallucinations, and fatal decisions. Many tragic climber stories begin in this very setting. Mountaineers who strip off their jackets believing they are overheated, or who wander in the wrong direction and vanish into the ice. This is why so many Everest tragedies pile up year after year, stark reminders of human fragility against the mountain. To put it in perspective, it's like trying to run with a plastic bag over your head. That's what it feels like to climb without supplemental oxygen. And it was under these very conditions that climbers like David Sharp and Joshua Kirui lost their lives, leaving behind stories that resonate as strongly as the silent marker of Green Boots Cave. One of the most debated aspects of Mount Everest deaths is the question of ethics. Why do so many climbers pass by someone in distress without offering help? The answer lies in the brutal reality of the Everest Death Zone. Carrying another human being above 26,000 feet can mean that neither will ever return. It's a dilemma where survival and humanity collide. There are accounts of Everest tragedies where climbers were left behind because a rescue was simply impossible. At the same time, there are stories of those who risked everything to save a stranger, like in 2006, when a few managed to bring down a critically ill climber to camp. These moments reveal how every decision on the mountain carries the weight of an entire lifetime. This debate between selfishness and survival lives on in the tragic climber stories shared by mountaineers. For some, leaving someone behind is unthinkable. For others, it's the only way to stay alive. Between harsh criticism and reluctant acceptance, Everest keeps gathering controversial cases, each reinforcing that the line between courage and recklessness is as narrow as the icy trail past Green Boots Cave. Everest holds more than 200 visible bodies along its routes today, marking passage points as if they were statues frozen in time. These Mount Everest deaths are not just numbers, but constant reminders that every step on the mountain comes at a cost. For many climbers, it's impossible not to reflect on their own fate when passing by these grim markers. Some have even become navigation references, like Green Boots Cave or Sleeping Beauty. These bodies, paradoxically, serve as silent guides on the path to the summit. It's a haunting scene that blends tragedy and utility, turning people into landmarks for other adventurers. Among all Everest tragedies, this may be the most disturbing. The high costs and extreme difficulty of recovery mean that most remain where they fell. Bringing down a body requires dozens of Sherpas, special ropes, and risks that are nearly impossible to justify. As a result, tragic climber stories remain in plain sight, reinforcing the idea that Everest truly is an open-air cemetery, and yet it continues to lure those who dream of the summit. Everest remains an unforgiving territory, where every achievement is marked by extreme risks and stories that will never be forgotten. The Mount Everest deaths are lasting reminders that the mountain demands absolute respect and never forgives mistakes. Among famous tragedies like Green Boots Cave or Sleeping Beauty, the mountain has become a silent memorial to those who never returned. These accounts, often called tragic climber stories, expose the choices, limits, and consequences that define the very essence of mountaineering. If you want to keep following powerful accounts like these Everest tragedies, subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications. That way, you won't miss a single impactful story and will always stay connected to the most haunting secrets of our world.